Hey folks, and welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And yes, I'm talking cables again. Some of you might want to switch off straight away. I know that some of you don't like the idea of cables making a difference to sound, and that's fine. Farewell if that's you. But for those of you that want to continue on and understand at what point potentially the difference between cables becomes minimal enough that you shouldn't spend more money, then come with me as I look to explore that. Specifically, what I'm talking about today are the Analysis Plus interconnects. These are very high-tech cables. They're made by a company that also makes cables for NASA, and they've got some specific technologies that they believe makes a real difference to how the conductor is able to carry the signal. What I've specifically got in front of me here are their Crystal Apex and Silver Apex cables. These are analog interconnects. They do also make the most digital interconnects, but these are the analog RCA and XLR versions of the Crystal, which is the copper, and the Silver, which is the silver. To give you an idea of pricing before we go any further, the Crystal cables here come in at $830 per meter, and that's whether it's XLR or RCA, it makes no difference. And then we jump up to $1,220 a meter for the silver cables. Now I'm saying per meter, but normally as you get longer cables, the price per meter actually goes down. So my point there is that's the price for a 1 meter interconnect. So you've got $830 for the copper, you've got $1,220 for the silver. One of the key technical features, according to Analysis Plus, is that these cables use their hollow oval core technology. And what that means is that through the middle of each cable, you've actually got a hollow tube. It's an oval shape with a hole in the middle. And what they do is they actually wrap the conductors around that hollow oval. The theory of that is apparently it means that the conductor is used more efficiently by the signal travelling through it, and therefore, according to Analysis Plus, it should reduce the sense of resistance regardless of which frequency. So theoretically, different frequencies will experience different levels of resistance as they travel through the wire, and that could therefore mean that different frequencies get attenuated more than others. Whether that matters to our ears and our gear, that's another question. We'll look at that in a minute, but that's the theory behind it. So on paper, we've got a very high-tech design, we've got very high-quality materials in terms of the copper quality and the silver quality. And then on top of that, if we just talk about build for a moment, forgetting about any of the technicalities, in terms of build, they're both really nicely built cables. They're identical other than the internal material in terms of the wire. And in each case, what we've got is a really nice clear but solid sort of sheathing on them. You can see there for the silver or the copper, whichever cable you buy. So you've got this nice kind of rubberized sheathing. It's shiny, it's smooth to the touch, but it feels quality. It's not one of those cheap plasticky feeling sheathings. At each end, we've then got our connectors. So this is obviously the XLR one. And in each case, they're very high quality feeling connectors, but also very industrial. There's no frills on these. They're not being done from a cosmetic point of view. They're just being done from a utility point of view, and I'm fine with that. So you've got XLR or you've got RCA. Price, as I said before, is exactly the same, and that's really all there is to it. They're a quality looking cable, but not a special looking cable. And so those looking for bling should probably look elsewhere, but those that are just after quality and a cable that feels like it will last you forever, these definitely fit the bill. And so being that we're testing cables, there's not really much more to talk about. There's no key features, there's no key functions. You plug them in and they play. One thing I should talk about when we're talking about plugging them in is that none of these cables from Analysis Plus are directional. Obviously the XLRs, you can only plug them in one way, but the point is you don't have to worry about directionality, which end goes to the amp, which end goes to the DAC. They're all exactly the same. Analysis Plus do say that some people choose to run the RCAs in a particular way based on the printing of the label, but they don't specifically recommend that that's necessary, just that some people choose to do it. And so my biggest question when I got my hands on these was, are they actually that much better than the other cables I've got here, such as the Curious XLR and the Curious RCA, the Supra Sword XLR and RCA, and also I've got buried in this pile here, and I'll show you in a minute, I've also got some much cheaper interconnects made of quality Litz wire from Gladiator cables. And so I was really curious to see, does the high-tech sort of sciencey approach of the Analysis Plus cables put them well ahead of other options, particularly something that's probably not particularly sciencey from Gladiator cables, and I don't mean that as a knock against Gladiator and Antonio who makes them, but my point is, those are just a basic high-quality wire woven together into a basic interconnect. There's no science behind it. There's no kind of fancy technologies. It's just connecting one wire at one end and one wire at the other. And so I was curious to see if it actually makes that much difference going to a high-tech cable like these. And so I've stepped through a whole bunch of different interconnects to see what I could hear. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page, and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended products database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list. And then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. The first test I did was to put the Curious XLR cables here up against the Analysis Plus, and of course both the silver and the copper. I'll talk about that in a second. And for all of my testing, I probably should mention I was running the TT2 as the DAC with the M scaler of course, and then connecting out of the TT2 and into the Burst & Soloist GT. For listening purposes, I was using the Meza Elites, and what I heard comparing the Curious XLRs with the Crystal Apex cables, the XLR still, what I heard there was cables that are very, very similar sonically. I couldn't reliably pick the difference between the two, and the only thing I probably would say is that potentially the Curious XLR might have sounded just a tiny little bit thicker and richer in the sound, but it's very, very minimal. And that's particularly interesting to me because the Curious cables, as I understand it from my interview with their creator, these have been made through a combination of some theory in terms of what should work and what shouldn't work, but then also a whole lot of listening and kind of tuning by ear, versus the incredibly scientific approach that goes into Analysis Plus. And the end result is pretty close. I do think the Analysis Plus are just a tiny bit more technically capable. They're probably just a little bit more transparent, whereas I think the Curious cables do have that slight sense of thickness or richness, but it's very, very, very slight. And to be clear, the Curious XLR cables have been my reference for a long time because I love them, so they're very, very good. They're not a thick, rich sounding cable. But when you put them up next to the Crystal Apex, you can hear that there's just a little bit something extra getting through the Crystal Apex. But we're talking 0.5% type stuff. And so given that you can pick up the Curious XLRs for around about $300 difference, it does vary on the Curious whether it's the RCA or the XLR, but for about $300 difference, you're not getting a significant jump in performance when you go to the Analysis Plus. There is a jump in performance, but it's very, very modest. When I moved over to the Silver Apex cables though, that was a slightly more obvious difference. What I heard when I went to the Silver Apex cables was that they were giving me a little bit more sense of extension and treble in the sound. It wasn't, again, a vast, huge difference, but it was more obvious. I could hear that I was now listening to a different cable. And so what I'd say is that if you're after a sound that is a bit more kind of cleaner, less rich perhaps, clean sounds like it's better. I don't think it's actually better or worse, it's just different. If you're after a sound that has that greater sense of extension, that slightly leaner sound, then I think the Silver Apex is a better choice than either the Crystal Apex or something like the Curious. But again, it's not a vast difference. It is enough that I personally find myself preferring the Crystal and the Curious cables over the Silver Apex, but that's going to be very preferential. If you like a brighter, crisper, cleaner sound, then the Crystal Apex could be a good choice. But really what this has shown me is that I think there's an absolute point of diminishing returns when it comes to cables. I think the idea of spending thousands and thousands of dollars on interconnects is potentially going too far. It's not to say you can't get gains, but the question is, are you actually going to even know that those gains are there when it comes to regular listening? In the case of a quick A/B switching that I was doing here, I could absolutely pick the difference in the sense that I knew there was a change. But as I've already said, which one's better or worse is hard to say. And if you'd switched them when I wasn't in the room and I came back in, I guarantee I wouldn't notice. I might notice it if you switch to the Silver Apex compared to either the Crystal or the Curious. And that's because the Silver, for me, was just slightly less enjoyable. The sound got a tiny bit drier, a little bit leaner, as I said before, and I like my music through a slightly richer source chain. And I'm talking really slight here, but it's just enough that when I flip back and forth, I found myself enjoying it more consistently through the copper cable. And for those of you sitting there thinking this is all mental bias, at one stage I had the Crystal Apex RCA and the Silver Apex RCA both running from, I think it was out of the Chord Hugo TT2 with an RCA splitter, and I had them both running into the LTA MZ3. That's a tube headphone amp. I've reviewed it recently on the channel. And where this is relevant is that over time I had it running that way for about a week or so while I was reviewing the MZ3, and I completely forgot which one was which. And yet what I was able to find was that there was one input that I was thoroughly enjoying the MZ3 and another input that I wasn't quite enjoying it as much. And sure enough, when I went and checked which one was which, it was the Crystal Apex cable, that's the copper one, not the silver that I preferred. So this is not just about mental bias, there are differences, but I can't stress enough how tiny the differences are. And so for me, if I was going to be spending money on the Analysis Plus cables, it would absolutely, for me, be on the crystals. A, because they're a bit cheaper, but B, because I enjoy them more. But before we stop there, let's talk about a couple of other options that you might also consider in terms of what might be the right interconnect for you. The next cable that I grabbed was the Supra Sword RCA and XLR cables. So these are the top of the range from Supra. They're a really lovely cable that only just misses out for me on being the perfect cable compared to the Curious. That's for me, my system, my budget, etc. And these come in just a little bit cheaper again than the Curious cables, which means you're spending about $380 less on a pair of the Supras compared to something like the Analysis Plus, depending on which one you buy, of course. And that's again for the 1 meter lengths. And for that money, you're once again getting a pretty similar sound. I knew this coming in because I already knew how similar the Sword cables are to the Curious, but they are also a little bit different. And what I found again was that comparing the Supra Sword cables with this time starting off with the Crystal Apex cable, that's the silver one, what I heard was again that little bit of extra sense of extension, that slightly leaner sound, and it was very much like what I heard with the Curious cables. Interestingly, what I found was as I was doing this test, it was easy to hear the differences with a simpler recording with these cables. And why I found that relevant and interesting to share was that where these cables really differed was that I found the Analysis Plus cables were bringing out just a little bit more of things like the detail of the room. You could hear a bit more of the sense of space, the minor reflections off the walls. Not that you can pick out the individual reflections, but you got just a slightly better sense of the space in the room, the reverberation in the room, the general ambience of the space. And so in the case of the Crystal Apex cable, I was getting basically the same exact tonality with just a tiny little bit more of that sense of room ambience, those super duper micro details. And in the case of the Silver Apex, then I was getting that little bit more sense of treble extension, that slightly leaner sound, as well as those same micro details and sense of ambience. But all in all, the differences were still really minimal, and whether it's worth spending any more than something like the Supras is really questionable to me. Yes, you can get gains, but the diminishing returns are really, really real at this point. And so by now, this testing was really proving to me that there's an absolute point at which I think spending much more on interconnects is something you should absolutely only do if you're interested in doing it, you're going to find it fun to do it, and you've got the spare cash. I would not recommend it to anybody who's seeking a drastic change in their system because you're not going to get it. You're going to get minor, very minor incremental changes, and I don't think it's worth the investment in a lot of cases. And so that then brings me around to how cheap can you go and still get a really good interconnect? When Antonio from Gladiator Cables sent me his last batch of headphone cables from his Caesar line, I asked if he could also send me a set of his XLR cables too. With no disrespect or negativity or judgment intended, these are a much more basic cable than what I've just reviewed here. In the case of these others, they've all got a lot of science behind them, they've got a lot of testing behind them. They're not just a case of finding a good quality cable and wiring it together into the XLR format. They've actually had a lot of testing, a lot of science, a lot of research. Whereas my understanding here, and there's nothing wrong with this, my understanding here is that Antonio has taken the best quality wire he can get and wired it up into an XLR setup. Meaning that he's connected the right pins together, he's insulated it or sheathed it somehow, and that's that. And so these cables are built around a Litz wire on the inside, I believe it's copper, and they're far, far cheaper than anything else on my desk here. So these you can get for about $680 less than the Analysis Plus cables. And so I was of course very interested to know how much of a trade-off you were making if you went down a cheap option. And what I'd say is that I did start to hear a more significant difference. I could clearly pick that there was a difference here. But whether it's better or worse, or preferentially to your taste, that's a whole different question. Because when I was using the Gladiator cables, the base was a little bit thicker, a bit more solid in some ways, and some will actually like that better. There's no way for me to say which is actually correct or incorrect. I dare say that I think probably what I was hearing from the Analysis Plus cables was the truth in the recording, but there was nothing wrong with what I heard from the Gladiator cables, and it wasn't like it was thick and muddy, it was just a fuller, thicker, richer bass. I also felt like the micro details, the fine information, the textual information was better from the Analysis Plus, and then even more so when I went to the Silver Apex cable. So for me, I was definitely hearing benefits in the way these cables are made, and therefore the money you spend. But for an extra $680, you've really got to question where you want to draw the line. And so in a second, I'm going to rank these and give you some arbitrary numbers just to show you what I think the steps up are as you move through these. But before I do, I just want to talk quickly about the fact that I also tested these with different sources and amps. And what I found as I played around was that it is very much one of those synergy things. Certain interconnects seem to work better with other amps, other DACs, And that's where sometimes it can be good to have a couple of different brands on hand. I really like having both the Supra Sword cables and the Curious cables, because on some amps where I want a slightly brighter sound, then I might reach for the Sword. If I want particularly to have a slightly richer sound, then I might reach for the Curious, or a more spacious sound, that's where the Curious is good. Whereas the Sword cables can feel like they're a little bit flatter in the soundstage. And so those are all things that I consider. It's not something I go nuts about, because you could absolutely go crazy and go way too far trying to match your interconnect to your DAC and your amp. But the point is, you can certainly choose different interconnects to suit whether you want a slightly brighter or slightly warmer sound. If you're at a high quality level, which all of these are, then you can't really go too far wrong, and it's just about tweaking the sound to your liking. And so let's bring all this to a close with me giving you a sense of how I've heard these perform. And as I said, I'm going to put arbitrary numbers to these, which I normally hate doing because it's impossible to measure the sorts of things I'm talking about. It's all subjective. But if I was to put the Gladiators as kind of the baseline, because these, out of what's on the table, are the lowest performance, even though they're at the lowest performance on the table, they're still very good, and so let's call them an 8 out of 10. If these are an 8 out of 10, then for me, I would put the Curious and the Sword cables at a solid 9 out of 10. So it's a definite step up from the Gladiator cables, but it's not huge. And then what I would say is that something like the Analysis Plus, those probably go to a 9.2 out of 10. So you can quickly see the difference here. The step between the Gladiator cables and what I would call the high-tech cables, meaning those really sort of scientifically designed ones, those do have a decent step up. It's a clear and obvious step. Whether it's better, that's going to come down to your ears, but it's definitely different. Whereas when we go from things like the Sword and the Curious to the Analysis Plus cables, that's a 0.2 or a 0.3 difference. Some might say that it's a bigger step. Some might say that going to the Silver Apex goes to a 9.4, 9.5, because it's a more obvious difference. But I'd question that, because I don't necessarily know that I always like the improvement. So yes, it's more of a difference, but is it an actual improvement? I'm going to have to leave that one up to you to work out. The key thing for me is that it gives me more detail, it gives me more sense of extension, but it comes at the cost, for me at least, and my setup, as being a less enjoyable sound compared to the Crystal Apex. And so for me, I'd probably put the Swords, in fact I'm going to split this up even further, I'd probably put the Sword cables at about a 9 or maybe an 8.9, I'd put the Curious cables at 9 to 9.1, and then I'd put the Analysis Plus at a 9.2, maybe a 9.3, now that I've broken things up more. But hopefully the point you're getting here is that for the extra money, we're talking $300 plus US to go up to the Analysis Plus from these guys over here, and for that extra $300 plus US, you're getting very, very incremental gains. So if you want to buy something that you know is the absolute best of the best, then the Analysis Plus might be a good choice. And of course, you can go even higher still. You can spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars if you want to. If I get a chance, I'll investigate those one day. But for now, what I'd say is that if you want the best of the best within the price range talked about here, then I do think the Analysis Plus is just a hair better. But for me, it's probably not better enough that it's worth the extra expense. And so hopefully what I've been able to do here is illustrate that spending a fortune on cables isn't a great idea. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't look to have better quality cables in your system, and this is a balance point for me. I know some people get quite heated around this. For me, it shouldn't be a cause of big debate. It should come down to the fact of, once you've got the rest of your system in place, the big ticket items like your DAC, your amp and your headphones, then if you do want to tweak it a little bit and get a bit more performance, I think interconnects are a great way to do it. But having said that, I don't think you should go overboard. Spending $1,200 US for a pair of Silver Apex interconnects on a system worth $1,000 total is absolutely ridiculous. You're going to get far more bang for your buck selling off some of those components and upgrading with the extra $1,200 that you've got in your pocket. Adding $1,200 to a stack of components is going to give you far more impact than a pair of these interconnects. But if you're anything like me and you've already got the system that you're really happy with, so in my case like a TT2 and an M scaler, connecting that off to something like an LTA MZ3 or maybe a Burson Soloist GT, at that point it probably makes sense to invest a little bit in interconnects, because you're not looking to invest any big sums in your amps or your DAC. So a little bit of a tweak with, say, a $500, $600 interconnect might make sense. Or maybe you're just happy with something like the Gladiator cables here for much less, knowing that they're an upgrade over a very basic rudimentary cable. And so that's what I'm hoping to illustrate here. Absolutely do not rush out and buy interconnects as one of your first things, not at this level anyway. An upgrade from the basic things that come in a box, absolutely, but spending thousands of dollars is something you should wait until everything else is in place. But once you do, hopefully I've clarified here what you can expect at each level. And if you want more clarity on interconnects, if this is maybe your first entry into reviews of interconnects and you're wondering what this means compared to the absolute base level, then check out my review where I went through all of the Supra cables from their very cheapest version all the way through to the swords here. That's going to give you a much better sense of what to expect as you go up through each level, how much the prices jump, what sort of performance and sound jumps you get. So check that one out if you're interested, but otherwise I hope you found this helpful. Hopefully it's clarified the diminishing returns and the gains that you can or maybe cannot expect to get. And as always, if you have found it useful, interesting, enjoyable, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.